privilege to welcome you to the opening of Beyond Borders 2018. Traquair weather and Traquair luck holds, so this is a very this is a very auspicious start to it all, I think. But 2018 is significant to this particular talk because, as you no doubt know, it is the centenary year of the birth of Muriel Spark, and we could not have a better way to celebrate that, I think, than my old colleague and friend here, Alan Taylor, who has written this book. Now, Appointment in Arezzo is, I suppose, a memoir. But in many respects, it struck me as I was reading it, I thought, this is a strange thing. Scottish journalist goes out to Italy to interview a somewhat reclusive and reportedly rather difficult exiled and famous author, and receives, not long afterwards, an invitation to go and house sit. Now, that's almost like the beginning of a Muriel Spark novel.
And I'd be murdered.
Who knows what unfolds after that?
Yeah.
Alan, tell us what actually did unfold and how did it come about?
Well, it's very nice to be here, by the way. Thank you very much, Geoffrey. It was back in about 1989, 1990. I was working for a newspaper called Scotland on Sunday at the time. And I had a very indulgent editor who let me travel the world interviewing the world's great writers. These were the days pre-mobile phones, so you could be away for a long time. You had no idea where I was half the time. I remember once being in Italy interviewing Gore Vidal, and the phone rang, and I raced down to get it. And he said, "Where are you?" He said, "You sound out of breath." And I'd swum to the other end of the pool. Those were the days. And he said once that, I'd interview all these international writers. Is there no Scottish writer I'd like to interview? I think he thought there might be somebody at the end of the 26 bus route in Edinburgh. And I said, yeah, there was one I really did want to interview. It's called Muriel Spark. And he said, "Oh, so where does she live?" I said, "Tuscany, I think." We made overtures, and amazingly, Muriel agreed to be interviewed. And I went out to Arezzo in the summer of 1990 to interview her. And it was a wonderful occasion, actually. I don't know if you know the town of Arezzo. It's famous for being the birthplace of Vasari. It's where the great Piero della Francesca frescoes are. And we met in the Hotel Continentale. Muriel arrived. She was 72 at the time, with her friend Penelope Jardine, with whom she lived in the Val di Chiana. And it wasn't like any other interview I'd ever done, really, with a writer. She seemed to want to interview me rather than me interview her. It was a great way of deflecting any penetrating questions. So she asked a question that it was very easy for me to answer. She said, "Where do you get your hair done?" And I said, "Well, there's this guy called Alfie who takes care of my hair, or keeps as much of it as I can on." And she said, "And do you get it touched up?" And I said, No, I don't get it touched up. I said, "Do you get your hair touched up?" Her hair was flaming red. She said, no. So I knew this was somebody I could work with. And on and on it went like that, her interrogating me about my dress sense. You'll see how it's improved since those days. And so that was that evening. I wrote the interview up. And one never expects to hear anything after that. That's usually the end of it. But shortly thereafter, a fax arrived from Muriel, a long fax, saying how much she'd enjoyed meeting. Her friend Penelope said it was like blood talking to blood. Penny talks like that, this rather spooky kind of way. And would I and my family like to go and look after the house, this 14th century rectory in the Tuscan countryside, for a month the next year? I thought, well, what am I doing? And so we went there. And I was saying the other day, I came across the letter, in the original letter when I was writing this book, and I had sort of read it very carelessly. You just read letters for the bit you want. The bit that says, "You'll please find enclosed a cheque for." And you think, excellent, that's all I need to know. And I guess I read that letter with that in mind. there were bits in the letter now that I look back and I thought would have given me pause for thought. For example, she said, the snake serum is in the fridge. Snake serum. I thought, what's snake? You know, and by the way, I have 2 rather large dogs and numerous cats, and it would be nice if you could look after them. Those were the kind of details. I had no idea, for example, how far off the beaten track they were, because I'd never been to the house. I'd only met her in Arezzo. This was pertinent because neither myself or my then wife drove. We had 2 young children, 4 and 6, so we had no means of getting food. So that was the start of it. And, you know, I went there, and Muriel was still there, and she obviously realised how feckless we were, and decided she'd stick around for a couple of days to allow us to buy enough food to see us through a few weeks. And off my wife and I went with Penelope to buy food, and Muriel, the least domesticated person on the planet, said that she would look after a 4-year-old and a 6-year-old. Well, Muriel's idea of looking after a 4-year-old and a 6-year-old was retreat into the house and get on with her new book, while these 2 kids wandered around this place with snakes and God knows what. And my son immediately fell into a kind of cesspit, you know, with snakes. And my daughter, age 4, ran through the house to find Muriel. Muriel, come quickly, Michael's fallen into a hole. And true to form, Muriel eventually arrived and said to Michael, and this was another thing about her, a friend of mine says that one of the great qualities of Muriel Spark is her sensibleness. And she said to Michael, age 6, Michael, how did you get into that hole? And Michael described how he got into the hole. She said, well, do the opposite and get out. Anyway, that was the beginning of it.
I think snake serum in the fridge and a small boy down a hole in the middle of the Tuscan countryside is very Sparkian in itself. I mean, I was going to ask you what impression you had of her before you went there, and whether or not it was completely changed by the time that you'd actually got to know her through these somewhat unconventional means.
Well, she was regarded at that time as a kind of an enigma. You know, people knew her best because of the Prime Miss Jean Brodie. I had read more of her books than that, certainly. But I guess I wasn't really in complete control of all her huge oeuvre. She wrote 22 novels, she wrote poems, she wrote short stories, plays, books for children even, essays. So I had a kind of vague idea of her. I knew from other writers how high the esteem she was held in was. However, in Scotland, she seemed to become something of a footnote, almost a postscript. Certain Scottish writers even said she wasn't Scottish because, my goodness, she only wrote once about Scotland. If only they were capable of writing that well once about Scotland. So she also had this reputation for being difficult, for being a bit of a recluse. So all of these kind of gave me pause for thought. You know, when I went to the interview, I was sort of fearful in a way that I wasn't really fearful with other writers. You know, I was never in any doubt that this was the great genius of Scottish letters over the last, 50 or so years. And in fact, you know, she's the best British novelist since about 1950, I think. I can't think of any better writer than Muriel Spark, and I'd be very happy to duel with anybody who wants to argue with that. So, you know, I realised I was dealing with a writer of great quality and a personality, a wit. Wits are very dangerous people, you know, because they're apt to say things that you can't predict that are going to come. And Muriel had this great ability to just be extraordinarily cutting in a kind of dramatic way. You know, I think of her pauses over dinner, and you just heard the silence, and you thought, God, what's coming? You know, what is going to come? And she would just come out with just sort of lovely little dagger stabs that were perfect, you know. I was like saying that a great friend of hers was an Australian artist called Geoffrey Smart, a wonderful painter. Geoffrey was a wonderful friend of hers and a great reader. And over dinner one night, Geoffrey said to her, Muriel, I've been reading about Aldous Huxley, who wrote Brave New World, etc. And Muriel said, oh, that's very interesting. And he said, well, he was a great fan of yours, wasn't he? There was this terrible pause. And Muriel said, eventually, why wouldn't he be? Why wouldn't he be?
I mean, the honours that were bestowed upon her were, in a sense, British honours, a damehood and so on.
What stupid things these are.
But then she constantly referred to herself as a Scottish writer. What do you think was so Scottish about her view of herself? What was it that made her a Scottish writer?
Well, her upbringing made her a Scottish writer. She was born in Edinburgh in 1918 to a pretty poor family by most standards. Her father was Jewish, her mother was Anglican. They lived in a one-bedroom flat in Bruntsfield, Lower Morningside, to those of you who are interested in these kind of things. She had great access to the two big public libraries of Morningside and the Central Library on George IV Bridge. She had a wonderful education, another very great Scottish thing. And she had a most inspired and eccentric teacher, and a woman called Miss Christina Kay. So I think by upbringing, by atmosphere, by weather, by architecture, by history, by a form of thought, by religion, she was very, very Scottish. Everything about her felt Scottish to me. The unsentimentality was extremely Scottish, hard-headedness, practicalness. Her mother had told her, for example, that if she never learned to do anything, she needn't do it. So Muriel completely took this to heart. She never boiled an egg or a kettle, as far as I was aware, at all. She just didn't think if she didn't need to do it, somebody else could do it. And I think that in some way, that sort of literalness is quite Scottish as well. But it was a Scottish mode of thought. And also, I say she was a Catholic convert, but she was a Catholic with a Calvinist work ethic. She got up in the morning and she wanted to achieve something by the end of that day. And I think that too is quite Scottish. And also, being Scottish, she had an ambivalent relationship to Scotland, that she loved being in Scotland. Her school days, her family life were the happiest days of her life. Until the age of 17, 18, she had an extraordinarily happy life. But she'd had enough of it. She wanted to see something beyond Edinburgh and Scotland. And so when the opportunity arose and she could get married and have sex, I dare say, she took it. And being Scottish too, like these kind of great romantic people, Bonnie Prince Charlie, Mary Queen of Scots, she was impetuous.
I mean, you say, excuse me, you say in the book that, rather a good phrase, I think, that there's a certain tendency in a certain type of Scot to measure Scottishness in carats.
Yes.
That it's a weight. Did she feel it as a different kind of weight? To be escaped from, she was an exile, in a sense, a self-chosen exile.
She called herself a constitutional exile. I've pondered this long and hard. I'm not even sure what it means. She also had a lovely poem where she says, "Heart of Midlothian, never mine. Heart of Midlothian, never mine." It's a lovely phrase. And I remember her being asked what she meant by that. And she said, "I can't remember." I sort of have suggested since that maybe she was a Hibs supporter. But that is a terrible bad joke. But she always said, I got her to judge a short story competition at one point, and I said, what should the qualifications be for the people who could enter this competition? She said they should be Scottish by formation, which is what she thought she was herself. She was Scottish by formation. And when we announced this competition, the Sun rang me up, and they thought it was racist to say Scottish by formation. I tried to explain what Muriel meant by it, and they said, well, we'll not bother running anything. They couldn't figure it out. But, that's what she was. That in a way, everything about her that had formed her was Scottish. That her education, as I say, the atmosphere of Edinburgh, the bricks and mortar that she was surrounded with.
I mean, you say rightly that she only wrote in depth about Scotland once.
Well, yes.
But obviously it was with her to. Did you get the sense, because she moved around, she lived in New York, she lived in Rome before she moved to Tuscany, that she had to escape where she was in order to be able to write about it?
Well, yes and no. Because the funny thing is that when she came to write The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie, she came back. She wrote The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie in 1961 in 6 to 8 weeks. 6 to 8 weeks. Think about that. That is unbelievable. But she wrote books very, very quickly. But she had to come back from, at that time she would have been in London. But she came back and she sat in the small back bedroom of the house, writing The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie on a desk smaller than this desk, this thing in front of us here. Ian Rankin's wife recently bought him the desk she's supposed to have written The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie on. But I said to Ian recently that, there's no evidence on that desk that Muriel Spark even ever touched it. And he said, well, what do you suggest? I said, well, why don't you carve her initials on it or something like that? That can denote it. But so I don't think she really had to leave it in the same sense of James Joyce leaving Dublin to be able to write Ulysses. I think that in Muriel's head was everything that needed to be there. She had a phenomenal memory for things and for dialogue and for people and places and all the rest of it. She said that Miss Christina Kay, who was the model for Jean Brodie, that when Muriel met her aged 10, she realised that here was somebody who she would have to write about. She started, she said, to write about her even then, aged 10. And the other interesting thing is Miss Christina Kay said to her, you will be a writer. You will be a writer. And Muriel thought, yeah, I will be a writer. And I will write about you one day. Now that is quite incredible. To be given the gift of a character and then to wait. What did she wait? 44 years, 45 years before she finally decided now's the time to nail Miss Christina Kay, and get her on the page.
In some of her other books, I mean, there are 4 that deal with her, that touch on literary production, societies, publishing, and everything else, which in a sense are autobiographical. I mean, the same sort of principle being applied, would you say? Something stored up and then distilled into another form?
Yes. As she said, John Masefield had told her, to a writer, no experience, nothing that happens is wasted. So you're going to mine your own experience when you come to write. And those great novels that are the kind of the London novels with the Girls of Slender Means, A Far Cry from Kensington, Loitering with Intent. These are all about Muriel's time in London when she came back from southern Rhodesia, having separated from her husband in 1944, and take her up to the point where she herself became a writer, or became a success as a writer in 1957 with the publication of The Comforters. And she always had, there were, her books are always incredibly funny, joyful. You got a great sense of spirit and elan about them. But there's always some dark philosophical underpinning to them. And then there's often another layer of reason why she wrote the book. A Far Cry from Kensington, for example, I don't know if you've read this book, but it's set in the world of books. Muriel used to call publishing and book selling and writing the world of books. I can tell you that is said with a touch of acid. The world of books, the pretension of the world of books. And a target in that book is her former lover, Derek Stanford, who she portrays in the novel as a hack writer, a pisseur de copie, called Hector Bartlett. And boy, if you're going to be written about in a book, you do not want to be written about in that particular way. Everybody everybody who has read that book and who knew the world of London writing and publishing, the literary world, the world of books, knew who the model for Hector Bartlett was. And when Derek Stanford died just a few years ago, several paragraphs of his obituaries were devoted to what Muriel said about him in that book.
Well, she had good reason too, didn't she? I mean, because he effectively betrayed her and betrayed her confidences and betrayed her inner self in many respects.
Well, when they separated, he wrote 2 books about her, which he said are full of inaccuracies. But even worse, he didn't just sell her letters to an American university. He stole her letters and sold them to an American university. So she just waited and waited and waited, and then got her revenge.
Served cold.
She was wonderful at this revenge thing. You know, the greatest story told about her, the funniest one, which she told herself in Curriculum Vitae, she worked for the Poetry Society at one time and edited its magazine, the Poetry Review. And poetry's always surrounded by people who call themselves poet, but, you know, couldn't really write a greetings card. And one of these people who wrote poems at that time and was a power in the Poetry Society was Mary Stopes, you know, of birth control. And she and Muriel did not get on well. And Muriel said what a pity it was that Mary Stopes' mother hadn't invented birth control. So that was the problem when you're dealing with Muriel, that there was always something like that could come back at you.
Well, you spoke about her silences.
She never said anything like that about me, by the way.
You spoke about her silences, and one of the things that not so keen critics have said about her writing is its underlying sense of cruelty.
Mm-hmm. Well, they're just stupid.
Leaving Hector Bartlett out of it,
yeah.
There is a sense of detachment and harshness, is there not?
Well, I would say detachment, but not harshness. You know, the kind of modern thing these days is for empathy. God, does that make me feel even saying the word? You know, I don't know what empathy's got to do with novel writing. But no, Muriel was unsentimental. Her great influence was the border ballads. She could recite the border ballads until the cows come home. And I think her novels are full of compassion, generosity, humour, insight. But she is brutally honest. You know, if you think about the girls in The Prime and Miss Jean Brodie, the girls in Miss Brodie's set are all described in you know, wonderfully vivid terms. But you can't say that this is somebody saying, well, here's a little 10-year-old girl, I'll pat her on the head and say, what nice. You know, one of them will become famous for sex. One is famous for her piggy little lies. Other is famous for just being a stupid lump. You know, she sees people as they are. She doesn't try to sort of then sugar it.
I thought, if I may, that I would try and include some of Muriel's voice, not from one of the novels, but actually this is from an introduction from the new edition, complete edition of her work, which is actually from a speech that she gave to the American Academy of Arts and Letters. And in touching on this, if I may, just to read out, because it touches on much of what you have said. She begins by saying that she has no time for sentiment and emotion, however beautiful it has to go. And then she says, I would like to see in all forms of art and letters, ranging from the most sophisticated and high achievements to the placards that students carry about the street, a less impulsive generosity, a less indignant representation of social injustice, and a more deliberate cunning, a more determined undermining of what is wrong. I would like to see less emotion and more intelligence in these efforts to impress our hearts and minds. The only effective art of our particular time is the satirical, the harsh and witty, the ironic and the derisive, because we have come to a moment in history when we are surrounded on all sides and oppressed by the absurd. The rhetoric of our times should persuade us to contemplate the ridiculous nature of the reality before us and to teach us to mock it.
This is before Trump and Boris Johnson. Long before Trump and Boris Johnson.
It makes a very consistent view of the way that she wrote, it seems to me.
I think it's a brilliant articulation of what she was about. You know, among her novels is The Abbess of Crewe, a very short novel, written right at the height of the Watergate affair, while the Watergate affair was still unfolding. And she took the Watergate affair and transferred the White House to a convent. And so this convent is completely bugged. Everything in the convent is bugged. Even the trees in the garden of the convent are bugged. And the abbess of the convent, Richard Nixon, is frantic because she's under fire from the media and from everywhere else. And out there somewhere in the ether is another nun who is touring the world just doing good things, Henry Kissinger. And the abbess is saying to the Kissinger nun, you need to get back to the convent. We've got a lot of... Well, I will come back quite soon, but I'm still dealing with this, that, and another. And it's so funny, so brilliantly done. And it's a complete satire, of course, of the Watergate affair. And it lives on long after the Watergate affair is gone and will be forgotten. Because it applies to all kinds of situations.
It is a shame she's not around now to deal with a current presidency.
How do you write about him? It's almost...
She'd find a way.
She'd find a way, I think. But at the same time, it's extremely difficult. Another of her wonderful books is called Aiding and Abetting, which is about the Lord Lucan case. That Lucan really tried to murder his wife, and the idiot instead murdered his nanny. But Muriel has a crazy psychiatrist, and two of the people who come to see the psychiatrist think they're Lord Lucan. So she has two Lord Lucans, not one Lord Lucan. And it's absolutely a fascinating book. And people wrote from prison to write to Muriel and say, look, I think you've got this completely wrong about Lord Lucan. There was never two Lord Lucans, all this kind of stuff. And, all these sightings of Lord Lucan and, Tesco's and stuff like that, along with Elvis Presley and people. I mean, you couldn't kind of make it up.
But within that particular book, I mean, the therapist in question is running from her own past, isn't she? She's been a false stigmatic, and then she's sort of reinvented herself as a completely high-expense Parisian therapist.
Well, honestly, one of the things that people say about Muriel's novels is that they're improbable. They're not at all improbable, at all. The idea that a woman uses her menstrual blood to pretend she's got stigmatic tendencies, I bet from Muriel's point of view, actually did happen. In New York in the 1950s or so, there was a guy called Joe Gould. I don't know if you've ever seen this film called Joe Gould's Secret. And it was written a lovely book called Joe Gould's Secret by Joseph Mitchell. And Joe Gould was basically a bum who had managed to convince New York literary society and high society that he was writing the greatest book ever written, an oral history of the world. And he would give poetry readings. And sort of intelligent people would turn up to these poetry readings. And he never read poems. He just squawked like a seagull. And everybody thought it was wonderful. So the idea that somebody, passes himself off as a stigmatic and then becomes a psychiatrist and deals with two Lord Lucans is quite, and by Muriel's kind of terms, that was fairly odd.
I mean, the extraordinary twists and turns that go through her novels. I mean, somebody describes it a bit like a fun house where things open and close and apparitions appear and things neatly fall back into place. In this particular book, The Hot House in the East River, one of the main characters, within 2 pages, you discover that her shadow falls the wrong way.
Yeah.
And in the end, it becomes a clue to what actually is the substance of the book, but it isn't immediately apparent.
No, but she's always playing around with things. I once asked her if she thought she had achieved what she set out to do, and she said that she did. She felt she had realised herself, and that she had opened doors and windows in the mind, and that she had expanded the boundaries of what a novel could do. People who write novels seem to forget the word novel. They're meant to be new. They're meant to be different. Each novel is supposed to be something quite remarkable. Instead, they all just churn out the same old stuff. When Muriel had a blank piece of white paper, which she said was her inspiration, her attempt was to try to do something completely different from the last novel. And I think that is an incredibly refreshing kind of thing to do. It goes back to the hair story, that when she went to a hairdresser and the hairdresser asked her how did she want her hair done, and Muriel said, well, just make me look different. And you'll see on the back covers of all these books there are different pictures of her, and she looks different from all the time. She was changing her appearance time after time. She would walk through airports and people would be standing there waiting to meet her, and she'd walk past them because they wouldn't recognize her. It's incredible.
Well, 22 novels and all of them different. And you sort of, in a sense, helped her research a couple of the last two.
So yeah, I helped. Well, she would write to me, and after I got to know her, she knew I'd been a reference librarian, and she would write and ask if I could help her in kind of vague terms or read things. She would say, "I'm doing a novel about redundancy. Can you send me everything you've got on redundancy?" Or I'm writing about Mary Queen of Scots. Can you send me everything you've got on Mary Queen of Scots? And so that kind of, so I would send her information and things that I thought she might find interesting. And she did do a fair bit of research every time she wrote a novel. And then she would pounce, as she said. So her last novel was called The Finishing School. And the papers in the National Library, she kept every scrap of paper for the last 50-odd years of her life, every scrap of paper. So this huge archive in the National Library. And the archive for The Finishing School is very interesting because she was 86 at the time. And she was, the novel is set in a creative writing finishing school in Switzerland. And so Muriel would go to Switzerland, stay in a 5-star hotel, and visit these finishing schools on the idea that she was going to send some kind of child there. And they would write to her and say, here's the prospectus for the finishing school, and this is what it will cost, and all the rest of it. And then this involves these young people who were at the finishing school, and she would get young people, she would write to them and just say, please empty your bag, your backpack, and tell me what's in it. And so these kids would empty their backpacks and send Muriel a list of the stuff that's in it. And there they are, in the novel. And I remember reading a review of the novel saying, she obviously knows nothing about, young people who would have these kinds of things in their backpack. And I thought, it's you that don't know anything about that thing. She's asked them. And so she did a lot of research, but she then, when she wrote very fast, at a lick, and hardly changed a word. Hand wrote, and hardly changed anything.
Did she? This was a particular sort of method that she had for herself.
Yeah. She wrote on, famously notebooks that she got from James Thin, the spiral Bothwells from James Thin booksellers in the Southbridge. And when she heard that the notebook company was going out of business, she mentioned this in an interview, and she was inundated with notebooks from these same notebooks. People had obviously keeping a stash of them. And she could measure, each notebook, I think, contained 10,000 words. So she knew if she'd written 4 notebooks, she'd got a novel. There's really nothing to writing novels, to be honest.
Having spent a considerable number of years in her company and visiting her and having the opportunity to discuss things with her, what did she in the end say to you or convey to you about the presence of God in the novels? Because it's been often said that he's the character that's never named but actually appears in every of the 22 novels. Is that true? Did she feel it was true?
I don't know. I mean, first of all, we didn't really talk a lot about religion. We talked more about shirts and stuff like that. But I think the reason why Stephen Schiff of The New Yorker said that the main character in her novels is God is that when you're reading a Muriel Spark novel, you feel that there's this great sense of control, that there's a voice speaking to you, that she never pretends that she's not writing a novel, and she never is trying to dupe you into thinking that you're not reading a novel. But the clever thing is that she's saying to you, beware, you're writing a novel, you're reading a novel, so all this is made up. But then the trick is that she does it so brilliantly that you forget even after she's told you you should remember. Does that kind of make sense? So that Muriel Spark is saying, here is this omniscient narrator, and it's me, and I am in control of this novel. And whether she then thinks that there's a higher control because of the rate the novels were written at, there's a kind of sense that she was almost taking down dictation, that somebody was saying, here's the novel, just all you have to do is write it down. But there's no writer in greater control of what she's writing than Muriel Spark, I don't think.
It's a strange twist on postmodernism, or the idea of postmodernism, isn't
Yeah.
it? Yeah.
Well, she was postmodern before anybody thought about that term, I think. But yeah.
Before we actually get to questions, which we must do, did you get a sense that she had any sense of her own impact and a legacy from her writing?
Well, yes, because she, as I said, she felt she'd opened doors and windows in the mind, and that she'd expanded the boundaries of the novel. I've interviewed many writers, and I've not heard any of them say anything like that. But she had a very keen sense of herself, and her own worth. She was pretty sure of how talented she was, and she wouldn't take messing from people. The letters in the National Library are wonderful, some of them, and there's one or two, for example, to publishers, her publishers. And the publishers, they write blurbs to books. And Muriel would write back to the publishers, I have no idea why you're my publisher. You clearly have not a clue what I'm doing. You've no idea what this novel's about, and maybe I should just go and get another publisher. I mean, that just sort of sends a chill through you, doesn't it? If you were the publisher and Muriel Spark had told you, like, this has come to an end. So I think also that, yeah, she had a good sense of her own worth, but she had been told from a very early age by her mother and by Miss Christina Kay that you must stand up for yourself. You must argue your own case. And she was a woman in the artistic world trying to make her way in the mid-decades of the last century, and this was very difficult. We just need to think that the 1950s was what everybody in the literary world knows as the decade of the angry young men. Well, the angry young men, it turns out, were pretty much second-rate writers. John Wayne, Alan Sillitoe, John Brain, even Kingsley Amis. The women were Nadine Gordimer, Doris Lessing, Iris Murdoch, Muriel Spark, and one could go on. And they are far, far, far better writers than the men. But that wasn't the way it was portrayed at the time.
I think we're going to ask our audience to stand up for itself. Question time. Lady at the front here. That microphone is coming down behind you.
Could you take a Sparkian pause and give a Sparkian comment on Trump, on the self-indulgent, narcissistic selfies of the modern era, and perhaps even a word on the Scottish Government draft cultural strategy? I'm sure she might have a sentence.
Well, I mean, she would think that. I mean, she took a pretty hard and sometimes interesting view on things. I remember watching Bill Clinton and the whole business of Monica Lewinsky and stuff like this. Muriel took a very European view that that's just the kind of thing men do. It's got nothing to do with the presidency. Just get on with things. I think so. Trump and his kind of sexual shenanigans, whatever, I don't think would have bothered her at all, really. Well, I think that would have fascinated her. I think she would have thought that something has gone seriously awry here. But I think she would have been interested in the sense of the way that Trump sways crowds. This is one of the kind of themes of the Prime and Miss Jean Brodie, of Mussolini, of Franco, of Hitler. And she would have seen the way that Trump sort of manages a crowd among his supporters and would have thought, well, is there anything new in this? Politically, well, first of all, the thing to say is that she was a European. Edinburgh was a European city. I am a European. And she would have been absolutely appalled by Brexit. There's no doubt about that, I think. That Penelope, her companion, still lives in the house in Tuscany, and there are problems with expats who are living there. And I think that she would have just been appalled because she would have thought, history has taught us what happens when Europe goes into schism. I don't think she was, for example, a supporter of Scottish independence. She didn't know enough about it. really, I think. We talked about it a few times. She once asked if Scotland would have its own army. I didn't know. She said, would we have our own ambassadors? And I said, well, I was looking forward to becoming the ambassador to Tuscany. And I did ask Jack McConnell that once. He just didn't even deign to give me an answer, frankly. She was politically individualistic, I think, that she would look at each issue as it came along. I think, in a way, living in Italy was a perfect place for someone like her, where the politics were almost unexplainable.
Another question, could we?
Sorry, well, I think she'd have been a tweeter, but she wouldn't have taken selfies.
Sorry to cut across you. Do we have another question? Because we are going to run out of time soon. Another lady at the front here.
You've spoken about Christina Kay and Derek Stanford, and of course her landlady appeared in some of the London novels. Do you think you ever did?
No. No, and I'm very grateful for that. I mean, certain people did from time to time appear in the novels, but given that Muriel's kind of view of the human comedy, it's unlikely you're going to be in a flattering picture, is it? But Scots appear in all of them. It's wrong to say that the Prime Minister Bird is the only Scottish novel, because when I met her, she'd written a partly Scottish novel called Symposium, which features the main character's a chap called Magnus, who's a madman who's let out at weekends to advise the family on how they run their affairs. And I said this was probably quite unusual and improbable. And Muriel said, not in Perthshire, it's not
wrong. Any more hands? Excuse me, any more hands for questions to ask? No.
She had a very interesting view of Scotland, I think. She although she did have an appetite for revenge, she was extremely forgiving. I remember she had a fight with David Dykes, and who she knew back from her childhood in a way. And then I was having lunch with her one day, and I got to the place we were going to eat first, and there was David. I thought, oh God, this will be terrible. I went down to tell her. I said, David's there. Maybe you don't want to go and have lunch. She said, oh no, I'd love to see him again. It was incredible. They'd been jousting and dueling in the pages of the TLS, and suddenly, this was all completely forgotten.
I think we are more or less at the end of our allotted time. I would just like to say, I was very struck by what you said about Muriel's sense of herself and her own place in things. And I came across a quote, which is actually from one of her characters, but it's herself as a character. I think that I was an artist was a conviction so strong that I never thought of doubting it then or since. And I think particularly with a new edition of the books out, and all of us here having read quite a number of them, I suspect, that we could sort of take that sentiment away, that she absolutely had no trouble in doubting it, and neither should we.
No, thank you.
Alan, thank you for encapsulating so much of it in your book.
Thank
you. If you haven't read it, please do. I'm not a retainer or anything else. I just recommend it as a wonderful insight into the remarkable world of Muriel Spark. Alan, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.